Hello, friends. In this knowledge node, I'll be walking you through chapter 1 of this book by Herbert A Simon, The Sciences of the Artificial. Chapter 1 is entitled Understanding the Natural and Artificial Worlds. So, we have natural science, and it's the study of natural objects and natural phenomena. An example would be like physics, which deals with forces and physical things like electromagnetism, planets, atoms, and other physical phenomena. There's also biological sciences, which you could say is a higher order of physics where it deals with life. It sits on top of chemistry, which deals with molecules and elements and compounds and how they interact with each other. And if they're carbon based and they interact with each other, they form life, and biological sciences study life. And it's quite wide because it also deals with heredity, genetics, there's also ecology. So these are the natural sciences. They pertain to natural objects, natural things, and phenomena. Now, one might ask, what is the aim of natural science? Well, one way of looking at it is the central task of a natural science is to make the wonderful commonplace, to show that complexity, correctly viewed, is only a mask for simplicity, to find pattern hidden in apparent chaos. So, an example of this would be like evolution by natural selection. So, how come there are a lot of species? For example, in an island called Galapagos, why are there so many species of finches or frogs? And it's like, what made these things? And even before we discovered or we saw the pattern of DNA, there were already some mechanisms that Darwin was able to fathom using observation and thinking, and like evolution is one of the key evolution by natural selection is one of the key foundations of the science that we know at the moment. So there's all this apparent complexity, but hidden behind it is this simplicity, like if you really think about it, all these things and all living things and how we replicate is sitting on the bedrock of four nucleotides like adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. So four molecular structures, compounds, nucleotides determine all this complexity. And now we're slowly unraveling the mechanism. So once we collectively as humans get to see the underlying simplicity amidst the complexity, one might ask, then shall we lose the wonder? In the sense that if we know that the rainbow is just droplets of water acting as a prism to sunlight, then do we lose the wonder that we have for natural phenomena like a rainbow? Well, one answer with this, which Simon made in his book, is that in this chapter, is that there's Stevenus. He's a Flemish author who translated most of the mathematical text and scientific text from Latin to Dutch. So, and he intuited, or he came about the principle of the inclined plane using geometry and also conservation of mass. So, and he created this crest where at the top it says Wonder and is geen wonder, and it translates as wonderful but not incomprehensible. So I guess what he's saying is, even if we've seen the underlying simple patterns that create this magnificent complexity, there's still wonder there. Like, even if we understand how DNA and the base pairs work, there's still this wonder on how instructions for base pairs, or for nucleotides in base pairs, result in the folding of protein that creates human epidermis compared to a rhinoceros epidermis, which is really hard, or a crustacean with their hard shell. There's still that wonder of how the simple core gives rise to this complexity around us. So it's still wonderful, but it's more comprehensible. And that is the aim of natural science. We keep on understanding more and more the reality we live in. And it's such an interesting field. But then, increasingly, and we've seen this in these recent times, that we live in an increasingly artificial world. It's not just the natural world anymore. If most of you listening to this, if you look around, you would notice that you live in a built environment. I'm in a room, this building's built. I go out, the roads have been made, the trees have been planted, electricity. Yeah, we are living in a largely artificial environment. Doesn't mean that by being artificial we bypass the laws of nature. We're still within nature, but it's no longer natural because it's human made. So there's also this, when we talk about artificial, we may think that artificial are those things that are plastics or that are manufactured, and biological things are natural. Not necessarily. There's not a strict equivalence between the biological and the natural. For example, a lot of the food we eat are not natural. We've grown them over centuries. Like the corn we eat now is not the corn that grows in the wild. By selecting seeds and keeping certain seeds, we've made the corn more yellow, more golden, more sweet. And even now we're increasingly also doing genetically modified organisms. So the food, the animals or the plants we eat, they're not naturally growing. Over centuries we have farmed them and modified them to suit us. So by saying that if something is biological, that doesn't mean it's actually natural, because we have been modifying them as we go along. So that's just a minor, or it can be key depending on the context, distinction. And next we have, so the question becomes, so we have the natural science, and we've distinguished that not all biological things are natural. There are some artificial biological stuff or organisms that we modify. So the question that Simon is asking, Herbert Simon is asking, could there be a science of the artificial that is similar to the natural science? So that's the question. So first we need to clarify, what do we mean by artificial? So a good neutral definition in this chapter is that artificial is anything that's produced by art rather than by nature. So Kevin Kelly, in his book Out of Control, this uses the term, it's between the born and the made. So things that are natural are born, with the proviso if we modify the organism, it may not be that natural. But there's a distinction about the things we make and the things that are born. And here it's between natural things or things that are made by artifice, by art. There's an intent to it, and we'll go deeply more into what constitute artificial. So again, to have a few more distinguishing things is there's a slight difference depending on the context between artificial and synthetic. So let's say if you have rubber that's made, and then the rubber you can't really distinguish it from natural rubber, we would call it a synthetic rubber. Whilst an artificial rubber will be a substance that has the property of rubber, but it's not actually it's distinguishable from rubber. So an interesting thing about this is I've been watching the Star Trek series Picard, and in that series they refer to the androids in that particular series, which is one of the protagonists. They refer to them as synthetics, and it's interesting that they use the word synthetics. They use the word synthetic because they're practically indistinguishable from humans. Even they themselves don't know that they're not human. So the way they use synthetic, it's interesting. So maybe, although it has word gravity now, if we're trying to create silicon-based intelligence that replicates human intelligence, strictly speaking, it shouldn't be called artificial intelligence. That will be called synthetic intelligence if we are neuron by neuron or function for function trying to imitate human level intelligence. But artificial intelligence is creating different forms of intelligence that have some comparable to human intelligence, but it's not exactly and is distinguishable from human intelligence. So there's just that slight differentiation between synthetic and artificial. So once we start talking about synthesis, synthetic, or artificial, we move from the realm of science into the realm of design and engineering. So science is really about analysis. There's the world out there. We analyze what's going on so that we can explain things and we can predict stuff that's happening in the world. Whereas design and engineering, it's about synthesizing things. We're making things. We're making stuff. So if we compare, so previously we have the natural science as dealing with natural objects and natural phenomena. Now we have design and engineering dealing with artificial objects and synthetic objects. Now I put in brackets design and perspective because like engineering is making things out in the world, but design, not everything design is actually made. There's a lot of speculative design, perspective design that may or may not see the light of day, but it's still creating it in the realm of possibility. So it's still in a way synthesizing it, but it may not be made incarnate. It may not materialize. It may just live in the computer or in the minds of the designers. So there's just that slight differentiation again. So as a designer and engineer, compared to a scientist where the scientist is really understanding what is, a designer and engineer, the question on their minds is how should things ought to be to attain certain goals and perform functions. So if you're an engineer, you know there are specifications on what you are going to engineer. And if you're a designer, there's a brief. And there's also ways of knowing what the user is, who the user is, who the end user is, who's paying for it, what are the constraints, what it's going to be made of. So there's an intent. There's an intent. It's not just like, oh, this is the way it is. You're actually saying this is the way it ought to be. And I think this is key. A lot of the things in, as we said earlier, a lot of the things in our environment has been made. It's artificial, and we take it for granted that that's the way it should be. It has been, but actually every single thing around us has been designed at one point in time. So someone made a decision to make the room square. Why isn't it like a geodesic dome, like Bucky Fuller? There are Googles of decisions made by different people at different points in time, which resulted in the environment we live in. But we have to be aware of that in the built environment, in the artificial environment, there are people deciding that it should be that way. But the beauty of that is we could change it. We could redesign stuff if we know that things have been designed. So the designer engineer answers the question how things ought to be to attain goals and perform functions. So that would mean that design and engineering is normative. It's like prescriptive. This is the way it should be. Whereas science is descriptive. It's just describing things as they are. It's not saying that this should be it. No, it's just saying this is at this point in time, given the experiments, given the theories that we have, this is how it is. But it doesn't mean it should be the way it is. I think there's a lot of cultural bickering happening when scientists say something and people automatically translate it to this is the way it should be because the scientists say so. No. They're just saying based on their observations. We can change it, right? Like the way our genetics, our DNA is giving us the impulse to care only for the people who are related to us over everyone else doesn't mean that's the way it should be. We have created culture on top of the genomics where we actually, in many cases, pause or go over this hurdle of caring for people other than those who are genetically related to us. We've managed to supersede that biological imperative by creating cultural imperatives or cultural choices beyond the biology. So back to artificial things. So artificial things have functions, they have goals, and they adapt. So this adaptation is quite key to making interesting artificial things. So the artefact, which is the object that has been artificially made, has a purpose, as a goal, as we've already mentioned, but it also exists in an environment. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's an environment, and that environment would then affect how the artifact can, or the extent to which artifact can achieve the purpose or the goal. So the interesting thing is, one way of looking at it is, so you have an artifact. So you have an artifact. It exists in an environment, and then there's the purpose of the artifact. But inside the artifact are the things which enable it. And so there's an inner environment of the artifact, and then there's an outer environment. So Simon in his chapter talked about clocks. So the clock, what is a clock? The function of the clock, the purpose of a clock is to tell time. And there have been different kinds of clocks made throughout history. So talking about the environment, in a desert-like environment where it's usually dry and there's a lot of sun, sundials work. But that may not necessarily work in in the North Pole, or in places where there's 6 months of darkness in the polar regions. There's also clocks that have been made to work in a ship. So the idea there is, how do you keep it stable to tell the time? So this was before electricity and batteries. So even the clocks we have now in our phones, they only exist right now because they exist in an environment where electricity is a utility, is readily available. So we can just plug in and charge our phones. If that outer environment was not there, then there's no sense in having an electric clock or a clock in our phones. Well, the clock in the phone can only exist if there's a mobile phone environment. So you could see how it's the same function, but then there are different ways of attaining the function depending on the environment it's in. So Simon then asks, what if we can look at the artifact as an interface between the inner environment of the artifact and the outer environment? So the idea being that sometimes we don't need to know what's inside the artifact, but we can predict how the artifact would behave if we look at the environment. So as I said, like, you would predict that a place with plentiful sun and no batteries and no electricity, it's more likely that they'll have a clock that uses sunlight, or in a place where it's in water, it's in a ship, so it's most likely to use something that would keep the orientation even though it's rocking. And the beauty of looking at this is that it not only applies to artificial things, it can also be, this kind of analysis can also be used for natural things. In fact, we could say that most animals in the Arctic or the Antarctic or in places where there's a lot of snow, most of these animals will be white. It's not because they've been designed like that. It's because we know this phenomena of natural selection, that these animals that survive, that pass on their genes to the next generation, would be those that can easily camouflage themselves in the environment. And we've actually seen this hypothesis tested in that, like, pigeons used to be whiter in the past, but as industrialization happened and there's a lot of smog and pollution, they actually change colors to be darker so that they could blend more into the industrial landscape. So there's this thing of, we can look at the environment, and just looking at the environment, we could somehow predict what kind of creatures will be there. So this is also used in things like science fiction. Let's say if let's say Dune, it's a desert planet, it's full of sand. What will be the great creatures there? Get sandworms, because otherwise there wouldn't be a lot of whales there because there's not a lot of water. So you could actually deduce what will be in an environment by looking at the environment, because we know that the organisms that will be in that environment will have to interface with that environment. So by looking at the characteristic of that environment, we can somehow make an intelligent deduction of what kind of things would be in that environment. So if it's a water planet, so a lot of the things there would be fish-like, or would have ways of locomotion, ways of moving that suits water rather than land or air. So this is a way of making intelligent predictions or theories by looking at the artifact as an interface between what's inside meaning the physiological things that make us alive, and the environment. And in a way, this is how we actually also relate to each other as humans, because I cannot know what's going on inside someone's head. But by looking at their actions, I can approximate, because we have this innate understanding of emotions and we have these mirror neurons where we could, okay, approximate what is going on. Empathy is possible because of this. We're using the interface of their body to approximate what's going on inside them. Of course, it can never be perfect, but it's an approximation, and most of the time it works. It's good enough. So yeah, we've talked about the natural selection process in evolutionary biology, and this interface concept or phenomena can also has been used in other things like economics, where we're using rationality as a proxy to predict what people would do. I mean, it's we'll talk about this in subsequent chapters in this book, but as a rough approximation, the way we use this is, if, for example, if a price of something goes down, more people would buy it, or if the supply goes down, the price will go up. And we've recently seen this with toilet paper. So there's a certain level of rationality that we could make about assumptions on rationality we could make about people, that they will behave like this if the environment they live in changes in this way. So if suddenly there's a virus that's causing a pandemic, it's easy enough to predict that there will be a spike in the demand for masks, for example, or antiseptics and all this germ fighting equipment. So because that's the rational human behavior. But of course, like everything, this has limits. So going back to being designers and engineers, so if you're designing an artifact, the idea is to construct the inner environment and the interface of the artifact in such a way that its attainment of the purpose of the goal won't vary even if the outer environment varies. So example of that would be in life there's homeostasis. So like me as a human being, if it gets cold, my body will do certain things to keep its core temperature. So if it's really cold and there's not enough heat to keep me warm, my body will start to shiver, because by shivering it will try to increase temperature to that homeostatic level. So that's the way the natural body has been designed. And when we're designing artificial things, like we have ways of attaining the same homeostatic state as in a living thing. For example, if you have a thermostat, there's a system of negative feedback. So if you want a room to be at a certain temperature, then you'll create a mechanism where, as the thermometer rises, when it hits a certain level, it will turn on a switch that would then turn on the cooling system, so that the room would cool down, and then the thermometer indicator would go down until it reaches a level. Then it will turn on the heating, so it's like a negative feedback in such a way that you're trying to limit, for example, if it's a thermostat, the temperature to a certain range. So that's a way of using negative feedback to make the artifact the attainment of the goal of the artifact invariant to changes in the outer environment. Another way of doing it is insulating the artifact from the outer environment. For example, in houses, where houses with good insulation tends to keep a certain temperature regardless of what's the weather like. So we're now getting close, it seems, to what the science of the artificial would be. So in a way, after going through these several steps of reasoning, we could say that maybe the science of artificial deals with this interface between the outer and inner environment, and using that interface as the source of abstraction and generality. There's a typo there, it should be abstraction. So that's the first approximation of what a science of the artificial could be. But then, of course, as Simon said in that chapter, if it's as simple as just specifying the inner environment and the interface to conform with the goal and change with the environment, then it will be like magic. If wishes were horses, then beggars will be riding, something like that. He said, I forgot the exact phrase, but we have to be aware that there are limits to things. So the inner environment is composed of things as well to make it happen, and those things obey the laws of physics. There's limits to what adjustments it could do to attain the goal. And also, even designing the interface, the artifact itself, it's only always approximating the purpose or the goal. It's like some of you who are designers out there would know that it's never design work is never finished. It's just when the deadline is there and you just have to stop. Because as a designer, we're always approximating what is it we want, because there's always trade-offs between viability, feasibility, and desirability. So you can always fine-tune all those things, and there's always better or different ways of doing stuff. By the end of the day, there's a deadline, and whatever is there is what you create, and then you just keep on iterating. So there are limits to things. It's not just a simple saying, we'll just create this artifact and this will adapt to the environment and we'll just specify it that way. Yeah, so it's like this quote I really like. It's like, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there's a difference between theory and practice. So we are aware of limits. So because there are limits to the inner environment and also to the approximation of the attainment of the design goal, there is a way where we could use the interface to simulate what we want. So it's like Simon calls it understanding by simulating. So he says the artificial object imitates the real by turning the same face to the outer system, by adapting relative to the same goals to comparable ranges of external tasks. So the idea is, as I said before, we could fine-tune how the artifact, as it interacts with the outer environment, attains the goal, and we could create lots of very different combinations of this to simulate what we want until we get what we want, really. So we can look at it as a simulation, as a source of new knowledge. So in the chapter, he said that some people might object to this, saying that, well, a simulation is based on certain premises, so a simulation is only as good as the assumptions you put into it. And Simon says, yeah, it's true, but even if you set the premises of the simulation, there are also things we could discover based on the implications. So, in future chapters of this book, we'll look at complexity. So, even given the same initial conditions, because of the number of autonomous agents and the number of the unpredictability of how the different components will react, even if you know the components, there are still something to be learned by simulating them, by making them, by actually creating them and letting them interact. So even if, let's say, like even dissecting a frog won't really make you by looking at the parts of a frog wouldn't really make one understand how a frog works. It's only by actually observing a frog in action that one knows what a frog is. So even if we know, because we created a simulation, we set the conditions for the simulation, it doesn't mean that we will not learn any new thing by running the simulation. By running the simulation, we might discover unknown implications or implications that were not known to us even if we set the initial conditions. That's one. And the other thing is, we could also use simulation as a source of new knowledge by simulating poorly understood systems. So the first objection assumes that we know what we're talking about, that we know the system and we're setting the conditions to simulate the system. But a lot of the things in the environment we live now are poorly understood. Like no one really understands how the economy works. But by simulating these poorly understood systems, maybe we get a better understanding of how they work. So that leads us, how is this possible? It's possible because when we simulate, we're abstracting things. So when we do simulations, we're actually looking at certain important things that are relevant to the inquiry and certain functions that are relevant. So we'll change certain variables and look at that. And we don't actually need to know how the inner environment works, as we saw previously. So for example, people have been working with chemicals, with herbs, with soaps, and we've been working with metals even before we understood how molecules and atoms work. So we've been predicting where the sun would be even if we didn't know that the earth revolves around the sun, but by observation we have been accurately tracking flooding and where the stars will be even if before we understood physics. So this quotation from the book says, this skyscraper construction of science from the roof down to the yet unconstructed foundations was possible because the behavior of the system at each level depended on only a very approximate, simplified, abstracted characterization of the system at the level next beneath. So if you know computer programming, it's a bit like object-oriented programming. So in an object-oriented programming environment, you have objects, especially things like Smalltalk, purely object-oriented programming, Smalltalk and Faro, the current iteration. You have objects, and the thing works by objects sending messages to other objects. So I said print or open. Depending on the object receiving it, that message would do different things. If it's a movie, it will play the movie. If it's a file, it will open the file. If it's a game, it will open the door. So I don't need to know what's inside that object, how the algorithms work, but all I know is if I send this message, this will happen. So I just need to know the right message. It's a bit like in Harry Potter, when you just need to know the right Latin words and the right gestures, actio, and this thing will happen. You don't know how it happens, and that is pretty much how we've been dealing with stuff. Otherwise, we wouldn't have progressed, because if we needed to know how atoms work before we could build bridges, then nothing would have been built. Because up to now, we still don't understand the actual composition of things. We're still debating: is quarks the end of the line, or is there furthermore? Is it string theory? Is it all a simulation? Is this just all is space and time just an interface to something, to a reality that's far wilder than we can imagine? But we don't need to know that to create computers, to create buildings, to create medicine, to eat food. So it's because we could just rely on the next level of abstraction, and that's enough. We could keep going down, but to do certain things, we just need to interface with the next level. And thank God, otherwise, we can't even do anything really. So sometimes when this is where the bias for action comes from designers and engineers. A lot of the time we're tinkering, we're doing stuff, even if we don't understand the thing, because it's by doing it is how we understand it. By creating the prototypes is how we understand it. Instead of sitting there and coming up with the perfect specification, sometimes it's better to start prototyping straight away. So now we move to computers. So we've been talking about artifacts, but if you really think about it, a computer is like one of the perfect artifact in a way, because as Simon says, a computer is an organization of elementary functional components in which, to a high approximation, only the function performed by those components is relevant to the behavior of the whole system. So, for example, Ada Lovelace created a computer programming even if before computers were invented. So she did math, because as in the quotation I just made, it's about the functions. It doesn't really matter what the underlying mechanism of the functions are. That's why you can have analog computing. Babbage tried to create one, and then you have the digital computing, and now we're trying to create quantum computing. So it's a bit like, I'll link it to, I've just been watching Altered Carbon. It's not really about, there's a substrate, but there's the thing that rides on the substrate. So in a way, a computer program can run on a Mac, and then if you can recompile it, it can run on a PC, it can run on an Arduino. It's a different substrate, it's the same program with some modifications or if it's really machine language, it will run in any of those. So it's less about the components, but it's more about how the components relate to each other. Again, we go back to this notion of the interface. It's how the interface with each other. It's why a lot of computing that now done, especially in machine learning or in the crypto world, maybe machine learning more, is using GPUs. These are processing units that were originally intended for gaming, for graphical processing units. But since computing is computing, you can find a way to use the same thing for other things, because it's not about the component itself, it's how if you interface the GPU with a different instruction set, it will do other things. So the question becomes like how to make reliable organisms from unreliable components. Components have the specified level of unreliability and being interconnected in the specified way. So a good example of this is the internet. So there's that protocol, the IP, Internet Protocol, that links different types of computers together. And each computer can be unreliable. It can just break. My computer can just break, or the connection can be severed. But because the protocol works in packets, when you get another computer and using the same credentials, you could request the same packets, and they'll come again, and they'll be assembled together. And like the internet is one of the first things that man has made that hasn't crashed yet since it's been made. It's because the way it's been structured is it's about the things connecting to it. And in fact, there are companies like Netflix who have Chaos Monkey. They actually have bots that try to bring the network down so that they know how the network can respond. So again, as in the slide, it's how to make a reliable organism out of unreliable components. So the internet is made so that things within it would go down, but then the packets will reroute and find another way of reaching. They just keep resending until the packets can be assembled and said, yep, we got it, and then it will stop sending. So yeah, it was basically made for the military. What if in case of a nuclear bomb that disables the main network, how can we still communicate? We can by having it distributed and packetized. So you don't need to maintain a connection that's stable to communicate. You can have unstable connection provided that there are multiple points of going around it. So it's a network. It's not a line. It's avoiding the single point of failure phenomenon. So we talked about simulation, because there's a tendency, if we think that computers can be just mathematically set up and proven, but in a way they need to be instantiated, so they're actually also empirical objects. One can't just create a computer. Well, one can create the idea of a computer using math or concept, as Turing did, a Turing complete, but people still have to build instantations of this idea, in a way that it's like spirit needs to incarnate in matter. In a way, the mathematical theorem of what a computer is needs to be incarnated in different types of computing devices or computing paradigms. So we can also look at computers as empirical objects. We build them and see how they behave. So we have a bit of theoretical analysis, like the lambda calculus to create Lisp, and then actually use Lisp in a Lisp machine to see how it works. So it's theoretical analysis with experimental work. So now, since we've been talking about the interface between the inner and the outer and computers, what if the more we experiment with the theory and the empirical experiments with computer, what can we achieve? So as we succeed in broadening and deepening our knowledge, theoretical and empirical about computers, we discover that in large part their behavior is governed by simple general laws. That what appeared as complexity in the computer program was to a considerable extent complexity of the environment to which the program was seeking to adapt its behavior. This is a key thing. Like if you really think about it, a computer really just input, processing, output. Really, and it's two states, ones and zeros, on and off. Very simple. But that simplicity, if it resides in the internet or large data, big data centers, the behavior will be very complex, even if inside of them they're very simple. So if you just have lots of simple things, put them together. So it's when they say more and more is not the same. There's a certain level, like in the same way that, for example, if you're the person with the only car in the country, that's a different experience than if you have millions of cars on the street. In the same way that the more of these computers we network together, it will create something far beyond what we can imagine. And I think we're starting to see that. But not only that, so for if it is the organization of components and not their physical properties that largely determines behavior, and if computers are organized somewhat in the image of man, then the computer becomes an obvious device for exploring the consequences of alternative organizational assumptions for human behavior. Psychology could move forward without awaiting the solutions by neurology of the problems of component design, however interesting and significant these components turn out to be. So again, we go back to this altered carbon scenario, and also how the idea that really the more we try to create one way of looking at artificial intelligence is it's a way for us to understand how we work. Because if we can create an artificial or a synthetic intelligence, then we know how we kind of know how we work in a certain way. In the same way that when we learn how to create artificial limbs, in order to do that, we have to understand how our own limbs work. Or we could also, with automatons, by simulating stuff, we understand what are the principles that are working within ourselves. So in a way, it's a way of looking at artificial intelligence as not being afraid of it in creating something that would supersede us, but in looking at it as a way of using it as a simulation to understand how we work. And I think there's more to be done in this area, and sadly, maybe a lot of the AI research has been hijacked by finance and thinking about more utilitarian stuff. But there's a lot of more room for speculative and explorative experiments in AI, not just utilitarian. So it's a way to really understand. If I was to create an artificial or synthetic human, I would use it not to replace me, but to understand me. You know what I mean? It's yeah. Again, in Picard, one of the pilot that they commanded, he created a lot of holograms of himself doing different things. But it's part of him is in the different holograms, and together they kind of simulate him, but he's using it to explore different personalities of himself. Yeah, that's me, and then I create different personas so that I can explore what would I be like if I was Spanish, if I was Scottish, if I was lazy, if I was a nerd. I create different versions of me. Why not? If we could do that, to see what different aspects of me can be instantiated in the world. So we could look at computers and the human brain both as symbol systems. The symbol systems are almost the quintessential artifacts. For adaptivity to an environment is their whole raison d'etre. That's their whole reason for being, is to adapt to the environment. They are goal-seeking information processing systems, usually enlisted in the service of the larger systems in which they are incorporated. So we have computers, like the devices we have here, and they're embedded in our culture, and they're serving a purpose. We're using them to do things for us, to achieve things, for me to record this and to broadcast it. Our brain and our nervous system as an organism is there to coordinate our survival, to survive in the world, to replicate, to pass on our genes, to move in the world. And then we, being humans, we evolve to not just survive, but to create beautiful things like computers and artificial intelligence and art and music. And it's mediated by the symbol processing thing in our head, consciousness. And there'll be more nodes on this in Lim University. Watch out for it. I'll be creating more nodes on consciousness. What is it? What is it really? But one way of looking at consciousness and computers, they are symbol processing systems. So with physical symbol systems, we just say physical because to distinguish it from organic. So we have symbols like ones and zeros, letters, mathematical equations, symbols. And then we group symbols together into symbol structures like expressions, sentences, words, sentences. And then we use those symbol structures to create internal representations of the external environment. And then we process these representations, we play with them inside the symbolic environment inside. And then based on the processing and the playing with the internal representations, we can translate them to action in the outer world. So this is how, for example, autonomous vehicles would work. An autonomous vehicle is being processed by symbols inside the computer that's driving the car or the truck or the scooter or the robot. So it's interacting. It can move within the environment because it has a representation of the environment inside itself, so it knows which to avoid. It doesn't have to be a full representation, but good enough to recognize which things to avoid and which things are good to travel on, and when to stop, when to start, and the like. So we've now come to the end of this chapter, and the chapter ends with, what if in the science of the artificial, all we need is to really understand how a symbol system behaves, and in so doing, we can understand how we can translate symbolic system interactions into general intelligent action in the world or in the outer environment. So that's it for chapter 1 of the sciences of the artificial. I'll be doing chapter 2. I'll be going through the whole book, and then as nodes, and then the whole thing will be a knowledge track, and then we can link the nodes to other books on the horizon. Thank you for watching and listening. I hope you learned something, and keep learning. Infinite learning, it's the way to be. See ya.